Hello, my name is Marion Christina Rohrleitner. I'm here in my home in El Paso, Texas, very close to the campus, which is one of the main reasons why I'm here in the United States. I'm originally from Innsbruck, Austria. I moved to the United States in 2000 to pursue a PhD in English, and then I found my home and my job in El Paso, Texas 14 years ago. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my food stories with you and some of my stories of my mom and my grandmother, who were much better cooks than I am. I am really excited to share especially one recipe with you, which is going to be an Apfelstrudel, which is a historically Austrian recipe, and Austrian food really means a mix of very different cultures. So where I'm from in Austria is about 30 minutes north of the Italian border. It's a bilingual region, a historically contested region, which is maybe why I felt very drawn to El Paso, Texas. And so the food in Austria, especially the part of Austria where I'm from, is really a mix of many different cultures. So most of the food I grew up with was a mix between traditionally Tyrolean food, which is farmers' food, which is food that has been recycled from leftovers. It's a working class people's food. So I don't make it as much, because it's very, very labor intensive, and also it's very heavy because this was for farmers who worked physically for 14 hours every single day. The food that I cook more, that was another major influence in my life, is Italian food. Most of my family has strong connections to Italy, especially northern Italy. My uncle lived for 40 years in Italy, moved from Naples to Rome and eventually to an area near Milan. And so I learned a lot of my cooking also from my Sicilian aunt. And the third major influence in Austrian cuisine is Bohemian cuisine, which is mostly the desserts, what we call Mehlspeisen, which basically means flour-based dishes. And so Austrian cuisine is kind of a mix of all of those. And just like Austrian culture, there's a huge encounter between East and West. I would argue that Austria is much closer to Southeastern Europe and Central Europe than Northern Europe. And so that all of that is reflected in the cuisine. So some of the dishes that I grew up with, that my mom made very well, and my grandmother made them even more because she very much grew up on a farm, and so was very familiar with not only cooking, but also preparing meat, for example, milking cows, making butter, churning butter, making cheeses. So my grandmother still had all of these abilities that I unfortunately no longer have. But some of the dishes that are really influenced by this farm culture, farmers' culture, and poor farmers' culture, because most of the farms are on high elevation, so they really don't have access to a lot of fruits, for example, which is much more prominent in southern Tyrol, which is now part of Italy. So one of the dishes that is kind of the quintessential, I would say, Tyrolean dish is called Speckknödel, which means something like bacon dumplings. Bacon, I found out when I moved to the States, is very different in the States than the Speck that I know in Austria. It is more of not so much a cured meat, but more a dried ham. So it's closer to prosciutto than to the kind of bacon you usually get in grocery stores here in the United States. And so that's one of the foundations of the dish. The other foundation is stale old bread. So again, this is about recycling food that is too precious to throw out. And so you use what you have, even if it's already stale old bread, and you use that as a foundation for the dumplings. They get mixed with eggs and milk, a little bit of flour, and the bacon if you have it, and usually also some onions. And so then you boil them in salted water, and you serve them either with salad as a main course, or you serve them in a soup. And if it's a broth that is made with beef, then that's usually what you would get on Sundays, because beef is very difficult to access for the farmers. Another, I think, really prominent dish that my grandmother made brilliantly, and which I hated. It's really the only dish I did not like that she made, and it's called Kuttelsuppe, which roughly translates as tripe soup. And so Kuttelsuppe is another one of those examples of using every single part of the animal, because these are poor farmers. They're not going to get a prime cut of steak. They're going to get the interior organs. And so a lot of these dishes, especially in Tyrol, are interior organs, which I'm not so fond of. And so I remember my grandmother one day when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, cleaning tripe in her kitchen, and I almost threw up, and I thought, what is this? This is appalling. I will never forget the smell. And what's really curious about this is when I came to the city of El Paso and I was hosted very lovingly by my future colleagues, one of the specialties in El Paso that they were praising is called menudo. And of course, I was curious and I wanted to try it. And so I took my first taste of menudo and I very quickly realized, oh, this is tripe soup. And thankfully, there's a lot of chilies in this particular version of tripe soup so that it covers up some of the tripe smell and taste. So I kept a straight face because I really wanted to get the job, and I also really did not want to offend my colleagues. And I ate menudo once and never again. So I mentioned my grandmother a couple of times. Her name is Antonia. She was born Antonia Matoy, which is actually a name that comes from the French part of Switzerland. There's some really interesting stories about my grandmother's background. There is a rumor that my grandmother's maternal family's background was Roma, which of course was a very difficult ethnic group to be a part of, especially in the 1930s and 40s, and so that was very much covered up by the family history for a long time. But my grandmother had a very rebellious spirit. So if I could share one of the stories of my grandmother's, which is probably my favorite story of all times. So my grandmother grew up in rural Austria. Sex education does not exist. This is a very, very Catholic part of Austria. All of Austria historically is very Catholic. And my grandmother, at one point when she was 16 years old, found herself pregnant by my grandfather, and she was immediately thrown out of the house by her parents because this brings, of course, shame to the family. My grandfather's parents allowed her took her in. But what they said, you can't live in our house and you need to live in a mountain hut right by the forest, sort of remote from the village, because we can't have you close. And so my grandmother at 16 years old, highly pregnant, was trying to make do in this small mountain hut. And my grandfather visited her every weekend, brought her food, took care of her. And so the village priest got wind of this and was very upset that this shameful girl is living in this mountain hut, and sent the police officer. And so the police officer knocked on my grandmother's door. She was 8 months pregnant at this moment in time, 16 years old, unmarried. Not a good situation to be in Tyrol in the 1920s. And so the police officer asked her, said, the village priest sends me, he's very concerned about this young man who visits you every weekend, and he wants to know where he sleeps. And my grandmother, without skipping a beat, allegedly responded, "Thank you. Please tell the priest that if he tells me where his cook sleeps, then I will tell him where the gentleman sleeps who visits me every weekend." So that's my grandmother's rebellious spirit, which translated into the way she lived her life all her life. So I just love that story. And of course, where she was able to cook in this mountain hut when she was so remote from everything always depended on what my grandfather brought her. So all her life, she was really, I think, an artist with making do with what she had. And so she shaped and changed recipes throughout her life based on what was available and what she could get. And of course, this is also the 1920s. This is the interwar period, which is when my grandmother said was actually the only time in her life when they were starving, when they didn't have access to a lot of food. This is thankfully an experience my mother did not have after World War II. My mother, Ingeborg Antonia, was born in 1940, but my father, Wilfried, also experienced starvation. And so this is something that is part of my family history too, which I think is why my father never throws away any kind of food, which sometimes poses problems, but he refuses to, and he always stocks up in his little stockpile to make sure that he'll never be in a situation where he doesn't have food. So this is, I think, how the history of the war really affected my family and our food history. So I moved to the United States in July 2000 when I wanted to explore the possibility of earning a graduate degree in the United States. I had earned a master's degree in American Studies and in Romance languages with a specialization in Spanish in Austria, in Innsbruck, Austria. But I was curious about exploring the possibility, but I wanted to first check out if this was something for me. So my alma mater in Innsbruck had an exchange program with the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. And I left in 2000 to sort of be a non-degree seeking student and just make sure I understand what graduate school is all about and if I want to dedicate, 6 years of my life and then maybe the rest of my life to this effort. And so I moved to Indiana in 2000. Well, first I moved to California, then I moved to Indiana. And one of my best friends, Peep, whose real name is Barbara, this is an image of her the year I left for the United States. And as a goodbye present, she gave me this wonderful collection of handwritten recipes with a lot of photographs. So this is something I cherish very, very much. And I was so happy about this book that a few years later, my mom, who always picks up on such things, for Christmas 2003, gave me this beautiful handwritten collection, and this is actually the postcard that she shared with me. This is my hometown in the winter, and this was a Christmas card. And so what she did, and look at that beautiful handwriting. So she wrote down all of her favorite recipes and some of my favorite recipes, including what I cherish a lot. Every time I went home for Christmas, my mom spoiled us with a huge amount of cookies. She usually made 12 different types of cookies for Christmas. I have no idea how she did this. And this particular section of the book covers all of these. The only ones that I have sort of mastered are Vanillekipferl, which is vanilla crescents. And this is also an interesting Austrian story. So the croissant or the crescent is very prominent in Austrian cooking, especially Viennese cooking, but also in Tyrolean cooking. And it's that prominent because the Ottoman Empire, of course, was in conflict with the Austro-Hungarian Empire at least twice in the last 450 years. And so when the Turks were at the doors of Vienna, and the Viennese finally were able to push them back to celebrate victory over the Turks, the Viennese created this crescent-shaped dessert, which is known in France as the croissant, and which we know as a Kipferl. And so it has moved basically from Vienna to Tyrol, about 5 hours west. And we still celebrate Christmas now in this maybe somewhat problematic victory over the Ottoman Empire. So history, I think, plays a really major role in a lot of Austrian cooking. And as I mentioned before, there's so many different influences in Austrian cuisine. Austrian cuisine is really a mutt, like all Austrians are, I think. We're a big mix of Central Europeans, Southeastern Europeans, Italians, Bavarians. Bavaria is maybe the part of Germany that is closest to us, but I always feel much closer to Central Europe and especially to Italy than I do to Germany, for example, even though I share a language with Germany. But the cuisine, the arts, the people in Austria are, I think, much more of a mutt, as I like to say. It's really a crossroads of multiple cultures and languages, and as a result, also cuisines. And so one of the most famous Austrian dishes is actually a Hungarian dish, and that's goulash, which we tend to make with polenta. My family used a lot of polenta, which of course is also the major food source or starchy food source in northern Italy. And so you see how there's a lot of connections between the East and the West in my experience.
How do they make the goulash, besides the polenta?
The goulash, what's really important, I think, is that you get the right cut of meat. And I had a terrible experience here in El Paso once when I just went and bought beef. And I thought it doesn't matter what cut it is. It needs to be a rather fatty cut. and you need to be able to cube it in equal portions. The other ingredient that is really important is Hungarian paprika, and I wasn't really able to maybe get the right kind of paprika, so now I tend to import a lot of these spices from Austria whenever I fly back, which I usually do at least once a year, usually twice a year. And then, of course, a lot of onion. And then you need the right kind of water. My partner, Nick, who's a visual artist, this is one of his paintings, always claims that the Viennese make the best goulash because they have the best water, which is coming from the Rax, which is a mountain southeast of Vienna. But the goulash is very spicy, and this is something that my mom really, really loved. She loved spicy food. So when my mom first came to visit me in El Paso in 2008, one of the things that she absolutely loved about Mexican cuisine was the spiciness and the chili. So this is something I have incorporated in my own cooking much more, and my mom certainly did. She discovered green chili, and she has been a big fan of green chili ever since. So she definitely started using green chili in her own cooking a lot more. And all kinds of chili, really. Which now are much more widely available in Austria as well.
Is the green chili by any chance hatch?
Yes, hatch green chili, exactly. That's usually what I took to share with her, and that's what my mom enjoyed the most. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Staying with Austria for just a few more minutes, can you describe what a like holiday meal would look like? Whether it's Easter, whether it's Christmas, but what are some of the experiences of when you live there in terms of holiday gatherings? What was on the table for eating and drinking?
That's a good question. So one of the major gatherings in Austria is for the extended family is usually December 25th. We celebrate Christmas with the smaller nuclear family, usually the evening of the 24th, and then the larger family gets together on the 25th. And so we have, of course, my dad's family is predominantly from my hometown, from Hall, which is about 10 miles east of Innsbruck, the capital of Innsbruck, of Tyrol. My mom's family is predominantly from the area around Innsbruck and from Italy. And so the gatherings, I remember when I was about 6-7 years old, were fairly large because a huge part of our Italian family came. My parents live in a fairly small apartment, and I have no idea how they did it, especially how my mom did it, but we managed to have at some point 18 people at the table. And we're talking about a fairly small apartment. So there were just multiple tables that were put together. And so I always admired my mother's ability to host this many people. She was one of the most generous people I've ever known. And she loved hospitality. She loved to cook for all of my friends, all of her family, all of my dad's family, of our extended family. So what it usually looked like is that my mom pre-prepared a set of appetizers. One of her favorites were these spicy sardine-filled eggs that she prepared very beautifully, also in this kind of 1970s style. She usually attached little flags. So when we had friends from a family from Italy, she usually attached Italian flags. Once I had a friend visit from Japan, and she created a little Japanese flag. So she was always very attentive to these details to make everyone feel very welcome in our home. Bread is really important in Austria, and this is one of the major changes that I've experienced after moving to El Paso. I eat a lot more tortillas, especially corn tortillas now, rather than bread. But in Austria, usually bread is served with all of the appetizers. Oftentimes we dip it in olive oil and balsamic vinegar, which again is an influence from Italy. So a lot of our food practices are really Italian. My mom also loved to prepare multiple salads, and there is even one salad that we call Italian salad, even though it's not from Italy. Just like the Viennese schnitzel, the Italians claim it's actually the Milanese, and the Austrians say no, it's Viennese. So there's some really interesting debate going on there, and that was a frequent topic at the conversation and the table. Who really invented the Viennese schnitzel. So we have a series of these appetizers. And then my mom usually made a Speckknödelsuppe, bacon dumpling soup, or if we had vegetarian guests, she made the spinach version of it, which is the vegetarian version of the dumpling soup. Sometimes, rarely, she made the cheese dumpling soup, which is amazing. But it's a type of cheese that is not available in the US because I would think it would be illegal because it is not something that is pasteurized. It's not something that is made quote unquote food safe, and it smells very intensely. And my mom said she refuses to have her house smell like this for a whole week because it really lingered. So usually she made the spinach version and the bacon dumpling soup. Another soup that we use a lot in Austria, especially for larger gatherings, is the Grießknöchelsuppe, which is also part of this collection. And this is made with semolina and eggs. And the secret to succeed is that you have to use the same amount of weight of semolina as the specific egg that you're using. And if you don't weigh the egg, then everything will be off. And again, for I think high holidays, we would use a beef broth soup. Otherwise, it would be a vegetable-based soup. And then for the main course, it really depended if it was our Italian family or if it was more of our Austrian family. For the Italian family, my mom always made lasagna or some kind of pasta. So we're on our third course already, right? You realize this. So these were extended affairs. I would say 8 hours of eating with interruptions. So some pasta was usually served as well. And then as a main dish, my mom really liked, and this is one of my favorite meals as well, she really liked to make saltimbocca, which is veal cutlets with sage and prosciutto, and usually served with rice and white wine. So you also asked about the drinks that were served. My mom really, really liked limoncello, so we oftentimes served limoncello as an aperitif. She also really liked Negroni, which is something that I share with her. I also really like Negroni, everything with Campari. So again, you see the Italian influence. And then my parents actually prefer to drink wine over beer, which is another difference between Austrians and Germans. I think Germans prefer beer, Austrians generally prefer wine. There's some pretty good wine from South Tyrol that we usually used, even though my dad also really likes South American, especially Chilean and Argentinian wine. And then as for dessert, it really varied. For Christmas, my mom made these amazing Christmas cookies, and I actually have a picture that I'm happy to share with you, where you see the range and the array of these beautiful cookies. One of my favorites, aside from the Vanillekipferl, are the Linzeraugen, which means eyes from Linz. And they're called eyes because they're basically these double cookies that you fill with jam, usually the amazing apricot jam my mom made herself. And then they have little holes, like 3 little holes in them, and those are the eyes. And so those are some of my favorite Christmas cookies that my mom served. Nick, my partner, and my dad really love this dessert, which is also a Christmas cookie that has this hilarious name. It's called Widow's Kisses, Witwenküsse. And it's very sweet. For my taste, it's actually too sweet. And it's basically made like meringue. So it's egg whites that are beaten, and then you usually add some dried fruit to it. And then you bake it as such. So that's another dessert that my mom served for Christmas, because the Christmas cookies were really the prominent ones. Another one that she really liked to make were the Rumkugeln, which are basically rum balls, and they're exactly what they sound like. They're made with chocolate, coconut, and a significant amount of rum. So at this point, our guests were usually already pretty happy. Also, in order to digest that significant amount of food, these multiple courses, what you serve in Tyrol especially is a little schnapps, which is maybe closest to mezcal, even though it doesn't have the smokiness of the mezcal. They're usually fruit-based. And so my favorite, I don't like schnapps very much, but the kind that I maybe like the most is called Vogelbeerenschnaps, and I honestly have no idea what that is in English. I'm not sure it exists. It's a particular berry that is called birdberry, and it's pretty tart, and that's the type of schnapps I like. A lot of people like the schnapps that is based on pears, which I think is also very prominent, and the one that is based on apricots, Marillenschnaps. So that would be a typical meal for Christmas. And again, we usually started, I would say maybe at 6:30. And I remember not going to bed before 1 a.m. Even when I was a child, my parents very much believed that there was no harm in having children stay up late during the holidays, which I share with them. So that would be a typical meal for Christmas. My mom, whenever I came back from the States to visit in the summer, in the winter, she usually always started making some of my favorite recipes. Apfelstrudel, which I'm trying to make today, is one of them. Another one of my favorite dishes is called Marillenknödel, which are also dumplings, but they're not made with stale bread. They're based on what we call Topfen. Topfen doesn't really exist in the United States. I've only been able to find it once at Specs and once at Whole Foods. It's translated as curds, but it's not exactly the same. The consistency is not exactly the same. Germans call it Quark, so you also see that Germans and Austrians use very, very different words for different items, but we call it Topfen. And Topfen is really the foundation of a lot of these Bohemian Mehlspeisen, these sort of flour-based dishes. And my friend Maurice always says she loves Austrian food because we eat dessert as a main course. And so this is what the Marillenknödel are. So they're made with Topfen, they're made with egg, there's a little bit of flour that is also mixed in. And you sort of form this dough, also a little bit of sugar, and then you take an apricot, take out the, what is it called? The stone, if I translate it literally, the pit, we call it Stein, the stone, the pit, we take it out and put in some sugar instead. So this is a pretty sugary dish. And then you form the dumpling with the sugar and the apricot and the dough surrounding it. You boil it in salted water, and then you serve it with something that all Austrians tend to love, which is breadcrumbs that are fried in butter, and then you add sugar and you add cinnamon, and then you roll these boiled dumplings in that breadcrumb mass. And so that was one of my favorite dishes. And again, it's pretty labor intensive, which I rarely make it. You could also make it instead of with curds, with Topfen, with potato dough. That's the more Eastern version. The Western version is more using the Topfen, but I don't like it as much. So usually I only get that when I'm in Austria, and it's one of the first things my mom always made for me when I came to visit. So now that I've moved to El Paso and lived here for the for the last 14 years, it's hard to believe that it's been this long. I've also seen my own cooking and eating habits and food culture change, of course, because of what's available and new products that I've learned to use. And also how I've seen the El Paso, food scene change over the last 14 years, which has been significant. So one of the biggest treats that I really enjoy, which is very simple, but which I love a lot, and when I only have a little time for lunch, what I love to make are just corn tortillas, which I like to just roast over my fire at the gas stove, and to fill that with avocados, aguacate, and with a little bit of lime and salt. That's a very little simple snack that I wasn't familiar before. I've learned to love avocados. When I was still in Austria, avocados weren't as widely available, or they were very expensive, and it was one of the foods my mom absolutely despised. So we never got it, and now I've become an avocado aficionado, and I just love it in every shape or form. So that's a major influence. The green chili that I mentioned before are definitely something that has made its way into my own cooking. In Austria, and you'll see that when I cook the Apfelstrudel for you, we tend to use a lot of almonds as well as hazelnuts, to some extent also walnuts. And now that I'm here, I've tried to replace especially the hazelnuts, which are not as widely available, with pecans, which I really, really love. So instead of using hazelnuts in the Apfelstrudel, I like to use the pecans. So those are, I think, some very simple major influences. Also, the biggest discovery maybe in El Paso for me have been tamales, which I absolutely love. And again, because they're made with semolina, right, with corn, which is very reminiscent a lot of dishes with polenta that I grew up with. So I think there's something that I recognize, and also that there's a savory version and a sweet version, which is very typical of Austrian cuisine. You can eat the Apfelstrudel, for example, with soup, with potato soup in a more savory way, or you can eat it with whipped cream or with vanilla sauce, whatever you prefer. So this idea of using the same item as a savory item and as a sweet item is something that we're very familiar with. What I noticed over the course of the last 14 years, I think that the El Paso food scene has really become more diverse. And there are, I think, some restaurants that moved from Ciudad Juarez to El Paso, which I think has also enriched the food scene here. I have to say, I don't know, am I allowed to advertise a specific restaurant that I love? I think probably my favorite restaurant in El Paso is El Emmy's, which I think is absolutely fabulous. I think that the way they use, or especially Oaxacan cuisine and reshape it into something new is excellent. I really love that place. Now I think that they're becoming very famous. It's going to be harder to find a table. But that's a place I really like to go to. I actually have to say, I still tend to cook a lot more at home than I go out to eat. So for me, it's something that is still, it's not rare, but it's not something that I do usually. Also, I really like breakfast, and usually then I eat dinner. So my dinner is my largest meal every day. If I eat lunch, I find myself getting really tired sometimes. So I usually prepare food at home rather than going out, because there are a lot of good food options here, of course. Another place that I like quite a bit is Ruli's, which I think is also a really nice place, or Eloise, which I think also offers interesting food choices. I also like Kiki's for really Tex-Mex food that is just a lot of fun. It's very heavy, but I also enjoy that every once in a while, especially when I have friends coming to visit. So I feel that the El Paso food scene has grown. Sometimes I wish we had a little bit more options for especially Asian cuisine, especially Thai and Indian. We have some, but I don't think a great selection. But again, since I cook mostly at home, going out is usually something that is the exception. That's also how I grew up. I grew up very much with home cooking, and going out to a restaurant was really not something that we did very much. What I do like is going out for brunch, and there is a couple of places that I enjoy quite a bit. I like Ripe. I like Crave. I forgot what this place is called. It's near Donovan. That's really fun. But I've also bought a waffle machine. So now I tend to do brunch at my house as well, because I think it's a lot of fun to make it. And I like to have people over at my house, which is something my mom really taught me.
A minute ago you mentioned that Emily is getting very famous. What's the reference? Why are you making that reference?
El Emmy's? Mm-hmm. Because it wasn't he nominated for the Beard Award, for one of the major cuisine awards. I think that's why, and he's made the news, and so I think there is much more attention to specifically the El Paso food scene these days, which I think is wonderful and much deserved and really long overdue, because it's such a great variety. I remember one of the first restaurants my colleagues took me to, now friends, was L&J's by the graveyard, which I also quite enjoyed, I have to say. And I just still explore. I think that there's still times when a new restaurant opens, I really like to go there and explore and see what I like. I never really go out to eat Italian food, because that's what I do at home. So if I go out to eat, it's Mexican predominantly, of course, because I think that's what is the best food that we can get in El Paso. But I still like to cook at home and also learn from my friends. I have Italian friends who live here. I have friends from Mexico. I have friends from Sri Lanka. And so I learn a lot from their cuisine as well, which I really like. Another restaurant that I really like in El Paso is Taconeta, because I love the variety of tacos that they offer. I really enjoy the drinks that they offer, and it's a very relaxed atmosphere. I like to go there both for lunch and for dinner. So this is a place I've gone to quite a bit with my friends.
Thank you for that. In terms of, so we talk a lot about places to go eat. Have you noticed any changes in terms of procurement of food, like places that we go buy food? Have you noticed any changes in the last 14 years in terms of where we actually can afford, but go and get some foods? That's a really good question. Where do we get food in El Paso, and how has this changed over time? And I would say what has changed for me is that I really like to go to farmers markets, Arduino's Desert Crossing, for example. Sometimes I also go to the farmers market in Las Cruces. So I really try to get more locally sourced food, which I think is the best way to get food. And so I've definitely done that much more than just go to a regular grocery store.
I also have to say that I liked the arrival of Whole Foods, even though I recognize that there's a lot of problems with it too, simply because they offer a really wide range of cheeses that I haven't been able to get elsewhere, and I'm a big fan of cheese. And they also offer fish and seafood that I wasn't able to get before. So that's something that if I want to cook a special meal, I also go to Whole Foods because I really appreciate what they can offer. But I would say the biggest change for me has definitely been just going to farmers markets and buying locally sourced food. I've also tried my hand during the pandemic to start in a little elevated bed in my backyard to grow my own vegetables. And the most successful ones have been tomatillos and zucchini, which is one of my favorite vegetables. So I'm gonna keep doing that. And I would love to keep doing more of that once I have a larger backyard.
Great. One of the last questions that I like to ask is, as you've been thinking, remembering your grandmother and your mom, and stories from Austria and eating menudo in El Paso, and so forth. If you can sort of frame in a few sentences, what does food mean to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what does food mean to me? That's a really large question. It means so many different things. I think having lived outside of Austria, with which I still feel very connected, last but not least because all my family still lives there and I visit frequently. During the pandemic, I even stayed there for half the year. It means family and it means comfort and it means home. I think that's what it means in many ways. Quite literally, when I eat Austrian food, it's like traveling home and remembering my mom and what my mom cooked for me, as well as my grandmother. So I think it means home and comfort to a large extent. And I think whenever I cook something that my mom made, I feel like she's looking over my shoulder and cooking with me. So I think that's what it means predominantly. I think I've also grown a lot more conscious about the connection between food and health. And by that I don't just mean my own personal health, but also the health of the planet. So I think I would say most of the time I cook vegetarian food. I actually eat fairly little meat. Maybe once a month. And then if I do, I want it to be something really special and really good. So that's when I go to Whole Foods or to Coronado Meats, which I think is a phenomenal butcher. Absolutely phenomenal. That's where I always buy my veal if I make saltimbocca. But overall, I think what has changed for me is also that I cook predominantly vegetarian. Even though I should say pescatarian, I'm lying. I really like to eat fish. And so I eat fish and scallops. So there's a lot of seafood that I really like. And that's maybe what I miss the most, that we don't have access to more fresh seafood in El Paso. But we're in the desert, so we have access to other things. I also really like to incorporate very, very local plants, for example. I didn't know that you can cook with cacti, for example. And this is something that I have learned and that I absolutely love. And I like to impress my friends in Austria with when I get the chance, because to them that's very, very exotic. So I think home mostly means home, comfort, memories. It's also a connection to, I think, my childhood. And also how our food practices are actually connected to the environment and how we hopefully can improve the environment with our choices. So some other food stories that I would love to share with you are where my dad and my mom was usually the one who cooked, even though my dad is a very progressive man for a Tyrolean man of his age, and he can cook to some extent. But he loved when my mom made him Mehlspeisen, these Bohemian sweet dishes, in part because his mother was from Bohemia, and so I think he was always felt more connected to that food and connected to his mom. So one of the dishes that my mom likes to make for my dad is called Topfenbouncen, which again is Topfen, the curds that I mentioned earlier. It uses a lot of flour, it uses eggs, so a lot of this is the same base. And then you roll these little sort of sausage type things, and then you cut them into little bouncen, which is what we call it in our dialect. And it's deep fried, so it's super healthy, you can tell. And then you boil some milk and add a lot of delicious spices to it, for example, cinnamon, nutmeg. These are some ingredients that you add. Cardamom, which is something that you add, and then you steam these Topfenbouncen in that milk, and that's actually a main course in Austria. So that's one of the things that my dad really loved. My dad is not someone who's very picky with his food. The only thing that he doesn't like is what he calls warm tomatoes, which sometimes poses a problem because so much of what we cook is Italian cuisine. So we oftentimes made not tomato-based dishes. So those are I think are some dishes that my dad really, really, really loved. I would like to share another story of maybe the craziest Tyrolean recipe, which didn't seem strange to me at all when I ate it as a child, but I realized when I told that story to especially Americans, they were kind of horrified. And it's also part of this book. It's called Weinnudel, which literally translates as wine noodles. The base for it in this particular case is semolina, and you create a semolina dough, again with eggs, with some sugar, with a little bit of flour. You again form these noodles similar to the Topfenbouncen, and then they're probably shaped about this size. You deep fry them, and then you don't serve them in milk, but you serve them in watered down red wine. And so the red wine is treated as a soup almost. And so this is something that we got usually during Lent. This was actually something that is a traditional Lent dish. And I think part of it was used, it's a South Tyrolean dish, so it's from the part of Tyrol that was part of Italy after 1919, because they produce a lot of red wine, and so this was actually something that was very affordable to them. But when I told this story that as a child I had wine as a main course, many Americans were kind of horrified and thought, oh my goodness, what are they feeding their children? But I absolutely love this dish, and it's one of those connections that I feel to my mom in particular when I haven't made it much, but whenever I make it, I really think of her.